Kim, great to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for being here, and thanks for all of you chiming in here. That's great. And Chris, it's good to have you back because you were out performing yesterday for the first time in how long?
It was over a year and a half since I last performed live in front of people. So not only was it something interesting for me to be in front of people again, particularly as many of you know, I broke a leg earlier this year. So it was a challenge to be walking enough to get into the venue, but that all worked fine last night. But also the music I play changed quite a bit over the past year and a half. So what I used to do live is a lot different than what I want to do live now. And so that was another challenge, was how to prepare for that.
Hmm. So I want to start out with a question. I know that in the last episode, Todd had this giant question about the meaning of life. But I know you, and maybe people know us from the work we did on Patch and Tweak. And I remember one of the things you had as a kind of a mantra almost. You said, I want to make it possible for people to create the music they have in their head.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, when in regards to performance and performing with Modular, uh, do you find that you create the music you have in your head, or does it, exceed your expectations, or, in other directions? How does that work for you?
I guess it depends how much time I have to rehearse before the performance. Because when I start creating a piece, I have an ideal of where I want it to reach. And then it comes down to whether or not I can get all of these unruly little pieces floating around in the air to come together into a form that's going to make a good continuous piece to play live. And I had a lot of trouble with this piece that I played last night. I've been working on it for about 3 weeks, which is very long for me to do for one piece, although it was 20 minutes long. And I had a lot of elements that I was very pleased with, but I was having a really hard time getting them to come together into a nice flow and an arc and to layer together nicely. And for 2 weeks, they were fighting me. And last weekend was the first time they started to like finally come into an arrangement. And then I went, okay, now I can realize what was in my head. And having had that time to put it together, I have to say that the final sound exceeded my expectation. Part of my concern of going out and playing in person live again is for the last year and a half, I've been playing music on that thing. And also on the other side of the room, I have a stack of other polyphonic keyboards. So at home, I can create a very large sound because I can create several voices at once on the Monster Modular. I have a handful of keyboards on the other side of the room. I can also go over and play and arpeggiate. And my concern was, can I make a big sound live with a much reduced setup? And I did modify what I normally take out. Previously, I would only take a 4-row 104 HP Eurorack case, and that would be it. But it was primarily to do percussion so that I could be the drummer playing with other people. And I could play back samples. So the solo pieces I did beforehand, I called them more like tone poems. They tend to have percussion, a drone, some sample spoken word. But I wanted to do live a bigger sound like what I could do with having the whole studio. So to achieve that, I kind of added to the system. I still had my case, but then I added to it some additional samples of long extended loops and things like that that I'd done on the polysynths. And then I also brought a Waldorf Iridium with me last night as well. So I could go ahead and play chords and other intervals on top of, layered on top of what the modular was. And I was very pleased with how the sound turned out last night. So it gives me hope I can take out of the studio what I've been doing inside the past year and a half.
Great. And I think you mentioned the other day that there's even gonna be chords, in your set, and now you said it also. And that can for some people be, oh, modular with chords, but that's where you mix it, right? You have a hybrid setup also,
Yeah,
and you do it your own way. Maybe I'm thinking just maybe we should show the
yeah. Go ahead and
you had
bring up the
a
system. I
post
can
with
talk
you.
about it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can talk about it meanwhile. Just share it here so you hope you can all see it now.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
system I was
So
rehearsing with in the studio. And the top is the case I call the TARDIS. And the way the case is kind of broken up is the top left of it is different trigger sources for creating different percussion rhythms. The top right half are various drum voices. You'll notice a few different WMD modules in there, in particular to the Crater for a kick drum, Chimera for big explosion type sounds, Crucible for really sick cymbal type sounds, Plonk. The second row down is mostly effects, along with some random control voltage sources, because I like to have a lot of smooth random and stepped random going in the performance. I had an echo chain going last night that you can kind of see in the bottom third of the second row, where the echo would go into a pitch shifter, the Pico DSP. So the drums would be shifted up a few semitones through a filter, the Bastel Ikari filter, then to the 4MS DLD for 2 different time delays, and then fed back through again. That was a fun thing because every hit of the drum came back as a higher pitched drum in 2 different places in the stereo field and 2 different times later. I was happy with the sound that made. And then the bottom part of the case is primarily a synth voice. The third row, the left-hand side are a couple oscillators, micro braids, and the clavis twin waves, a Polaris filter, a WMD performance mixer, which I just completely maxed out. The WMD performance mixer, I already had the expander on it, but each of its channel has A and B inputs, and you can switch between A or B, or the two are mixed together. I had so many sources going, I was in many cases using A and B on many of the channels. I've outgrown that mixer, and I'm actually thinking the next step for this case is to replace that mixer with something like an Expert Sleeper's ES9 and do the mixing in the computer. That's probably the next evolution of this case. And then the bottom row, the left hand is an acoustic input section, and then the bottom right is the vector sequencer, my sequencing section. And then down, if you scroll a little bit towards the bottom, that's the extra toys I brought with me for this particular gig. I really like the Strayman Night Sky. It's a nice reverb, does a really lovely shimmer. It has nice modulation and filtering built in and all that jazz. The launch pad in the lower left allows me to change scenes on the vector sequencer. Last night's piece had 10 different scenes, different combinations of sequences that it stepped through. The black box is a sample player, and I had both timed loops. I created 64 bar long loops of my vector synthesizer that I kept as a kind of a harmonic cloud or drone going on. And the vector sequencer would actually trigger those loops down in the black box. And I had them 2 different notes, C and F, that I could go between. And then lower right is the Waldorf Iridium, which is a polyphonic synth that I'm very, very fond of. I kind of think of the Iridium as being, it matches my ideal of what I want my modular to be, in that it can do many different sounds. It's virtual analog, it's wavetable, it's FM, it's sample playback, it's granular synthesis, it's a resonator. And you can have any of those in any of 3 different slots for 3 different oscillators with a huge modulation matrix. So the Iridium embodies what I want out of my monster studio system, a playground where I can get a lot of different sounds out of it. And that's why I really like it. You'll notice no keyboard. This was my first time playing melodic stuff, or at least a repeating theme, without a keyboard. I was actually using the pads on the Iridium on the right side to play it, including through different key changes.
And they are velocity sensitive?
Unfortunately, they're not. You just set the velocity with a knob. The weakness of it is that they are not velocity or pressure sensitive. And that's one of the strengths, for example, of the ASM Hydrasynth, is that its pads are pressure sensitive. And I almost brought the Hydrasynth instead of the Iridium, but I like the wider range of sounds the Iridium gave me. I love the Hydrasynth, but it's a certain range of sounds. And I went through about 5 or 6 different patches on the Iridium last night to keep changing up the sound on it.
It's there's some interesting things I want to ask you about, and this is also because I compare it to my own way, obviously, of making a performance setup. And if any of you guys in the chat have any thoughts about this, just put them in the comments in the chat, and we'll get Chris to look into it. But one of the things I'm thinking about, yes, you mentioned the big performance mixer, for example.
Yeah.
I've always wanted myself to put quite a bit of small mixers here and there in the system, both to allow more spontaneous patching and also to allow for more flexible routing somehow. So what's gonna, the ES9 will not take all the space of this mixer. Will you consider other mixers throughout the system? Or how will you do that?
Yeah, there are a couple submixers in
Really
here
quick.
already, though they're kind of buried in the cables. For
Mm.
example, between
Yeah.
in the third row, between the Clavis Trin Waves and the Polaris filter, is another small pico mixer, and I use that to
Mm.
actively mix different outputs between the braids, the Clavis output, and the suboctave output. And that's one of the things I was doing last night. Is started with just the Clavis, then brought in the braids later on during the piece. But I will also
Mm.
be adding next to the S9 at least another stereo submixer. Now, one thing that is nice about the WMD performance mixer is it does have a couple effects synths. So there is some flexibility for me to take any of the channels and send them back out to the reverb that's also near a happy nerding effects aid, or to my echo
Mm.
chain. And I actually bring the effects returns back on normal channels in the mixer, so I can then send those channels out to a different effects chain if I want to. So there's a lot of flexibility in the WMD performance mixer, but I do understand what you're saying about wanting
Mm.
to submix. Um, a lot of the reasons I have a centralized system like that is I also like to record everything on individual tracks later on, so I can go ahead and remix and edit stuff later on. And one of the attractions of the
Mm.
WMD performance mixer, you can maybe see two large snakes going over the right edge of the case, is I have the
Yeah.
DB25 breakout that gives me the individual inputs to the performance mixer that I can then send off to the computer.
Yeah, that's nice. I'm thinking you mentioned also this is on another note than mixing, but the random stuff you want to have going on.
Yes.
I was curious actually because some people like to set up patches that are so generative that you can interact a bit, but it could almost be a whole performance by itself. And my feeling is when I listen to your music and also see your videos, and we can watch maybe a clip of your performance from last night a little bit later here, that um, you have very much things set up, as you say, and then you allow some things to be interacted with. And the random interaction, the where you have some random modules doing stuff, modulation, whatever. Do you have a way of, turning that up or down, attenuating that or mixing it in, or how do you work with that?
Yeah, I do have a couple different ways of doing that. For example, in the second row of the case, if we start over on the left side, the black module is actually a micro marbles. It's a Cara. So I do have a marbles, and then right next to it, you'll see the levitate attenuator. So a lot of my random control voltages, stepped or smooth, from either the Pamela's workout or from the Cara marbles module, go through that
Mm.
attenuator, so I can dial up or dial down the amount of random signal getting through the modules downstream. Another thing I really
Mm.
like about marbles is that it has like a bias control where when it's fully counterclockwise, it's putting out one voltage right in the middle. And then as you start to increase it more clockwise to 12 o'clock, the range of voltages spread more and more. And at 12 o'clock, it's the maximum range of random voltages. And as you go from 12 o'clock further to the clockwise extreme, then it's just the lowest and the highest voltages. So for example, last
Mm.
night, I had a couple outputs from the marbles controlling the decay time of my kick drum and controlling the, the pitch that was going to the crucible, the cymbal module. So I started with them just being one decay time, one pitch on crucible. But during the performance, I would turn up that control and then allow the kick to start varying between muted notes and long notes, and allowing the crucible to start having more and more range in its randomized pitches. So that's one way that I
Mm.
will use random modules dynamically during a performance to change the feel of it. The other thing I relied on quite heavily down in the lower right corner is the vector sequencer. I had one section during the piece last night where it was playing a mini rings, a micro rings version of the Mutual Instruments rings. And it started off as a very simple 16-step sequence where 8 steps were high C and 8 steps were low C. And I had rings set up to just play a note when it noticed the note changed. So that was the initial sequence. So it said, oh, I only see 2 changes in the whole sequence, when we go high and when we go low. So 1 bar bing, and 1 bar bong. But then on the vector, they have what are called chance operations. So I set up chance operations for all those notes where the function would be go up 5 semitones, a perfect fourth, and I could change the probability of how many notes would get that shift or would not get that shift. So I could start off with just high, low, and start turning in a little bit of probability where fourths would start to appear in the sequence, or dial that back if I want to thin it back out again. And another thing I used for the first time last night is I let the vector sequencer be a soloist. It has a function in it called evolution, where it will look at the root key and the scale that you've said that sequence is in. This particular passage was in C Phrygian. It's C natural minor, but the second's flattened as well. And when every time I hit evolution, it says, okay, I'm going to change a couple of the notes based on some musical rules inside that scale. So I was basically soloing by going evolution. Do I like it? Then I'll let it play for a few measures. If I don't like it, I'll hit evolution again for the next measure and come up with a different variation of the sequence. So I was letting the sequencer develop its own variations, and I was interacting and choosing which ones to keep or which ones to reject while playing last night. And that was another way that I interact with chance operations and with random functions.
That's cool. I'm thinking that that's one of the things I noticed you also spoke to Todd about last time, and also we've talked about this thing about how many times can you play the same note without people getting bored? And yeah, and I know that's important to you that things change. Actually, maybe some people would say frequently. Others would say, it's okay. How have you come to terms with some, how long between or?
It's something that I personally fight with because between having a short attention span and being highly self-critical, when I'm listening to myself play, I feel like they're bored, change it. They're bored, change it. They're bored, change it. And it's a struggle with me when I'm playing live to take a deeper breath and slow down the breathing rate and the heart rate and let things live a bit longer. And I've talked to some friends of mine, like Steve Roach is one of my music mentors. And I said, how can you stay in the summer space for so long? And his reply was, well, first, I come up with a set of timbres that he really enjoys just listening to. And that makes him less motivated. Motivated is the wrong word. Less compelled to constantly change it if he's happy with the space he created in the first place. So that's something I'm focusing more on, is creating a set of sounds that are complementary and that I like, and I could listen to just those sounds for a while, so I don't feel compelled to like I have to get out of this space into a different space. And it also helped that I was the last on of 7 acts last night, and in that case, it made me a lot of the other sets had less evolution than I would normally do myself if I wasn't calm. And that kind of put me more of a mindset of like, okay, it's all right. You can go ahead and luxuriate in this one and let it go ahead and stretch out a little bit long. And it ended up being about a 20-minute piece last night.
Nice. I guess it's something about also how can you say how, yeah, you said being calm, but also kind of maybe, I don't know if resting is this the right word, but resting in your music, in the things you do. I remember that Hans Zimmer said, when you're patching stuff, you have the time to think before you do it or while you're doing it. How does that influence you when you perform live? Do you feel that you have time to do the stuff you want to do actually, or do you feel afterwards that you could have done like 20 things more that you didn't have time for? How's that?
I kind of compose it in the opposite direction, is that I compose based on giving each musical idea as much time as I feel it needs. And then that decides whether or not the piece is going to be 5 minutes or 20 minutes. So rather than going, oh, I only have 10 minutes, gee, I have 5 other musical ideas that didn't get in, I instead kind of start organically at 0 and I grow the piece out till it hits the time limit. And then that's when I stop composing it. But I had a pretty free time limit last night of how long I was going to be. And my original goal was, try to do at least 15. Tried not to go over 30, was kind of like what was in my head, and it just naturally flowed into being about a 20-minute piece where I had
Mm.
several movements and changes in it, and I was pleased with it the way it was.
Great. It's great to hear that you're also very aware of the time and also the context, because that there are other people playing before or maybe even after you. I think we probably all here have tried, if you've been performing with your modular or at all performing, that some people lose their sense of time, and so you can risk getting on and your time slot is moved like an hour later or so. And I know there's some places like a codex, or you have to be aware of that. But I think also with modular, I think it might be easier to lose yourself in the process somehow. So it seems like you're very aware of not getting lost.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've observed from a different part of my life when I used to do a lot of work in the video and film world and would give presentations that time on stage does not match real time. Um, at
Mm.
first, you think, "Oh, I've already done a lot, and it's only a few minutes. This is going to be fine." And then suddenly it's a half hour later, and where did all the time go? And I think it's easy to lose the
Mm.
concept of time while performing. But like I said, my problem with time is that I'm too nervous, and I try to push more things faster. And I've been trying to purposely slow down time while I'm playing. And I, we're going to talk about books a little bit later on. Between a book you turned me onto, Effortless Mastery, and some other books I've been reading, there's been this really interesting discussion about, um, yeah, that's
You
a
have to.
fantastic book, yeah, about whether or
Mm.
not something is conscious or subconscious. When it's with your conscious mind and you're having to think about every action you do, your reaction time is slower. It takes you longer to do something in response to stimulus. And your brain is using far more energy. They actually see that there's more brain function going on. There's more heat being generated by your brain when you're consciously thinking.
Mm.
And the idea behind rehearsal is to push conscious reactions into subconscious. Subconscious has a much faster reaction time. Things happen much quicker and requires far fewer brain resources. There's less brain activity. There's less heat generated by your brain actually while doing it. And part of the book Effortless Mastery that you held up is the idea of like practice to the point where things get into your subconscious. So when you go play live, you're not having to sweat the details. It now is flowing because you know it well enough that it's a subconscious action rather than like, what should I do? Oh, I have to patch this to that,
Mm.
which takes a lot more time.
Yeah. I think that must also be an interesting difference from when you're playing with others, because I've tried when I started out with modular way back. I was also playing live with a violinist, and I kind of envied her, ability to just go all over the place whenever she wanted. At a split second, she would be this note, that melody, that timbre, and I was trying to tweak my modular, and I felt left behind sometimes, and I was almost getting anxious. And, oh, I have to do something too, and then I started just tweaking the oscillators, following, fluidly her stuff. So how has that been for you? I know you mentioned the decay on the bass drum, and you work a lot with the drums, and when you played with others, you also, as you said, focused on the drums. So how do you deal with that when playing with others?
It's changed a lot over the years. 20 some odd years ago, when I was playing with a bunch of people in LA in the band Cosmic Debris, um, I had the luxury of being the person who set the environment and set the rhythm. And then I had other excellent jazz trained musicians who could quickly improvise over top of that. And that was a luxury for me because I was still attentive and I'm still putting in changes, like listening for, okay, I think the solo is coming to an end. I should put in a change 2 measures from now. But otherwise, I didn't have to worry a lot about what key are we in? What note should I play on my solo and things like that. When I got into modular, it was much more of a case of me joining in with other people who are not used to playing with other people. And now I was in the role of having to react to them. And a lot of it came down to tweaking out sections of my system where I could make rapid changes. For example, one of our participants, Dennis, asked, what was the blue module with 3 rings of lights up in the upper left corner of my case? That's called a Euclidean circles. And it has 3 different rhythm pattern generators And the LEDs show you which notes are going to fire for every circle of the ring, which tends to be a measure of the music. And the knob says, how many beats should I fire during one circle? And it distributes those beats based on Euclidean math. And I will use that module in the upper left quite a bit to make something more complex or thin it back out by just turning the dial to say, I need more notes in a measure for a busier pattern. I need fewer notes to really make this far more sparse. And that's one of the modules. The grids, which is to the left of it, those three sliders control how dense are the beats in each of those three trigger output channels. So if the slider's all the way down, it may be putting out one beat every 2 measures. It may be putting no beats out at all. But as I push the slider upward, then it puts out a higher density of beats. And I was using that for the kick pattern last night, where I started the piece with just boom, 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 boom. But then as the piece gathered up energy and I changed sections, I kept tweaking up a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher for a more and more frenetic kick pattern. Well, then I also use Euclidean circles to counter the kick with an African drum, 1 per measure, 2 per measure, 3 per measure. Then to start doing counterpoint against each other, then start backing it back down towards the end of the piece. So it was like designing a set of modules that allow me to quickly react to what does the music need right now? It needs another percussion line. Turn up Euclidean circles to activate one of the trigger patterns. It needs a lot of activity. Make things busier by pulling up the fill amount on grids. Oh no, we're going sparse now. Start pulling down the density of the beats. So a lot of this has been choice of modules that allow me to just do a quick reaction rather than having to program in a whole new drum pattern, for example.
That's interesting. So you control your drummer. That's really nice. I think a lot of us who've played in bands wants to do that sometimes.
Yeah, I joke as I'm the conductor for my modular basically, and I'm conductor like, okay, up, more energy, forceful, like okay, down. That's how I prefer to think about controlling my modular rather than, oh, I should go into this pattern that has this African rhythm in it. That's too many clock cycles while performing live.
But it's interesting you say you designed a set of modules that will accomplish or allow you to accomplish what you want. And it's interesting this time, even during, and I guess we can still say during the pandemic, that a lot of modular manufacturers are still putting out modules. Are there any recent modules you've seen that you think are, adds to the performative environment? Or if you could, that's one question. The follow-up question would be, if not, what would, if you were allowed to, or if you could design your own performance module, what would that include?
Yeah, one of the modules I'm actually interested in adding to my system is one that I've seen you add to your system, and now I'm interested, is the qubit data bender, because it seemed to fulfill in my head two seemingly competing desires of one, to be rhythmically based, to know where the one is, to do stuff on measure-based intervals, because I'm still very percussion focused inside. But on the other hand, to then do its own thing and add its own variations in without me constantly having to write it. That I can set it to something and say, okay, do something every couple measures, sit back, let it do its variations while I go focus on a different part of the modular. So probably the data bender is the next one I'm interested in adding to my system. If I have
maybe I can just
go ahead.
Comment on that.
Because you have more experience.
It's great for that.
Yeah.
No, I just want to mention to those of you, if you don't know the data bender, Jeremy from Red Means Recording have done some excellent demonstrations of the data bender from Qubit.
Yeah.
So I can recommend that. Yeah. And now to your module, Chris. So
I think too many modules don't have an intelligent rhythm sense, and that's what kind of drives me a little bit crazy. Is, for example, I like to use probability modules like mutable instruments marbles or the Lattic probability skipper to take something like a 16th note high note pattern and randomly punch holes in that pattern. But the problem with some of those modules is they don't know where the one is, or they don't care where the one is. They might drop the one and keep the other beats. So quite often I find I'm using logic modules to pull off a downbeat from, say, Pamela's new workout, put that into one input of an OR function, then take the output of my probability skipper and put in another function of the OR, and then send that off to the module. So I know I'm always getting the grid of, say, hit on the downbeat or every couple measures, but then it's being filled in with random events in between those. And a lot of modules that have random functions to randomly skip stuff treat every beat equally, and not every beat is equal in a lot of music. In a lot of music, downbeats have more importance than some of the other beats, and they don't have any knowledge of that. And I like to see LFOs, not just be tempo time, but for me, it's kind of silly for a sine wave to start at 0 on the downbeat. For me, a downbeat might be where it should be a cosine where it's at its peak, and then maybe comes down off that, then builds back up to the peak on the downbeat. And too few LFOs that have tempo sync have a phase shift where you can say, no, where do I want the LFO to be on the next clock, as opposed to merely being in time with it. LFOs should have swing function, as far as I'm concerned, rather than being wah, wah, wah. It should be wah, 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 to add swing into the modulation.
That would be cool.
Yeah. And to me,
you see a whole new way of dubstep, doing dubstep.
Yeah, but as someone who I'm not a master drummer, but I have sensitivity towards rhythm, and I just think a lot of modules are based on a very scientific of, okay, we're going to produce this waveform at this tempo, without thinking about what's happening with the rest of the music. How do I fit into the rest of the music? And so it's not like one module, but just an intelligence I wish more modules had overall of like, just give me the clock so I know where the 1 is so I can put emphasis on that. I'd like to see more modules have that function.
I totally agree. I use the chaos from Clank, and they also have the probability stuff. And what annoys me is also that you can, obviously you can time it. Yeah, congrats. It's an amazing
I've not had a chance to learn it yet. You're the one who turned me onto this. I've not had a chance to learn this yet, but it's obviously a priority of mine because it's right there.
Awesome. Yeah, but I think again, you're totally right. You need to then put in logic modules to achieve what you want. So something like that combined in a module would be cool. I'm thinking of one more thing also that I know you are pretty keen on when you do not just your performances, but also your music or your tracks in general. And that's the live percussion elements. And you mentioned you had on your live case the live input section.
Yeah.
Can you tell a little bit about, and maybe we should soon see that clip also, but
yeah, I did not do any live percussion last night because feedback is quite a concern in live performance. But yeah, I do have an audio input on the case because I have a collection of hand rattles, percussion objects, bells, things like that I like to add as accent. In a live situation, you have to deal with the reality of things like speakers and feedback into microphones. So I'm doing more and more of having my own rattles and things like that and recording my own underlying rhythm tracks. So rather than firing one sample of a rattle, every eighth note, I'm playing it live with my own perfections and my own inflections into the sound, and then create a long loop of that I can then play as an element that has more of a human feel. And I like to have more of a part of my goal with modular is to bring a human performance feel into modular performances. And that's one way I do it. Another thing I like to do in my modular system, either the big studio system or the portable system, is the audio inputs are right next to a rings module, which is a resonator. A lot of people use rings with its own internal sound source with just a burst of noise then fed through the resonator. But the rings does have an audio input where you can put anything through it. So another trick I like to do is to take a hand percussion item or even a rain gourd, which is something you can rotate continuously, and it continuously has like a rain stick, rain falling sound, and put that through the resonator so it starts pinging off these tonal sounds. And then once I'm in that domain, I can actually start pitching what those sounds are or have the pitch of that sound change, using another sequencer inside the case. So I do like to bring a more human element in and bring in the occasional bit of hand percussion to add as accents. I love rattles where I can just go ahead and bring an accent and bring it back out again. Tibetan bells, things like that. And also, I tend towards ethnic instruments that have less refined sounds. I like things that have rough, slightly untamed harmonic series and have those edges to them rather than just being machine-like perfection, because again, I think that's a nice contrast to the very pure tones a lot of synthesizers create.
That's a good point. Maybe it's time. Should we see the clip from your performance last night,
Yeah,
just to see
yeah, we can play a little bit of that.
how that
So
went?
this is a case where I'm trading off between letting the sequencer play rings and me manually playing the Waldorf Iridium. So let me go ahead and bring that up quickly here, and we'll play a little bit of that for you.
Wow, nice.
Thank you.
Real nice. Yeah, that leaves already. Todd, you have to ask, of course, stereo or quad?
Unfortunately, stereo. My mixer I'm using, for example, is stereo, and this guy who brings sound only brings a stereo system. But it's interesting that you bring that up,
Mm,
because one of the things that came out of last night was we have a lovely um, mixed media art space up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, called Currents. Currents used to be an annual festival of mixed media and intermedia art, video projections combined with other things, with music, etc. But now they're running a full-time gallery up in Santa Fe. And half a dozen people from Currents were down at the performances last night. And one of the things that shook out of this was they'd really like to put on an event in June. They'd like music to be part of it. They asked me to be one of the performers, but also they said, we'd really like to do multi-channel sound. So
mm.
that might give me my
That's
motivation,
great.
Todd, to get
Yeah,
into quad. Michael Stearns, good friend up in Santa Fe, likes to do stuff in quad as well. So I think that'd be an opportunity for maybe me and Michael to do some quadraphonic stuff up there. So I'm looking forward to that.
that sounds cool. Yeah, exactly, Todd. I totally agree. I once experienced, yeah, Susanne Chani here in Copenhagen also actually, and also some other modular performers doing quad, but they used it like they kind of made this audible wave throughout the room, so people were almost swaying back and forth. It was very powerful. So I'm kind of keen on, just now you can use your imagination now. How would you utilize that quad feature when doing your, let's say, your drum sounds, for example?
I did some
Have you thought
interesting.
about that yet? Or?
Yeah, I've worked with a very good friend of mine back from the days when I played in his band, Cosmic Debris in LA. Is a guy by the name of Richard Bugg. Old timers, if you've ever had the Paya Modular Synths red flexi disc that was demos of the Paya
Mhm.
Modular, that's my friend Richard Bugg who played all the tracks on that. He now does multi-channel sound for Meyer Sound Labs, no relation to me. And whenever Richard goes and plays, he likes a multi-channel sound system. So we've done some experiments in the studio of what works and what doesn't work. For example, if I have a drum loop, like a drummer playing a kit, having that drum kit move around the whole studio was very disorienting. Um, uh, we found some things you want to have in what's supposed to be the front of the room. But there's other things that I like to do in stereo already. For example, I will quite often have a sample and hold triggered on the beat of the sequence to randomly change the pan position of every note of the sequence or a drum pattern. That would be fun to do in a pointillistic way in a quadraphonic space. So it's, just, the pinging of rings could come from all around you rather than just in a left-right stereo field. I also use a lot of ambient recordings as part of my performances. That
Mm.
piece last night was called Iceland, and it has a lot of recordings of surf on rocky shores in different locations in Iceland, Arctic terns, and stuff like that. I had to basically pick like one or two sounds at a time to have up front, but this would give me the opportunity to have, say, a more dull surf sound like on a sandy beach in front of you with something on rocks behind you and have both of those loops going to give you much more of a you're in a location feeling of the space
Mm.
and put birds in a particular area or even fly the birds around you and things like that. So that's just from the piece last night. That's some of the things that pop into mind of what I'd like to do in quadraphonic space. Um,
Great.
yeah.
So yeah, I hope you note this down. Otherwise, I'll remind you
Yeah,
because it sounds
we
great.
have a recording of it, so I'll remember it for later.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm thinking also for those of you who don't know Chris's, if any of you don't, YouTube channel, I just posted a link here to one of the, this is just one of your videos when you do your music on your alias zone. Um, so I'll just put this here. Also, I noticed on that, I don't know if that's your video background. Obviously, it probably is. You put other imagery in between. Is that again the desire to not bore the viewer, or how is that?
Yeah, there's a couple combinations of why I cut in other imagery into the performance videos I pre-recorded and play later. One is, I think it's boring to have a one camera shot on a person performing for 20 minutes. Um, so in my studio here, try to have like at least two cameras set up. And a trick that I do is I tend to have a camera that has a very large frame size, like 4K, double of a high def video frame. So even with one camera locked down shot, at different points in the video, I can focus on this part, focus on this part, focus on this part of the frame, slowly push in and slowly pull out. So that's part of
Hmm.
the the DJ's idea of don't lose the dance floor carried over to video is constantly keep motion and constantly have things going on in it as well. But also a lot of my pieces do have a concept at their core of them. There, there's a story or there's a location or there's an environment that I'm trying to convey in the piece. So I
Hmm.
try to include snippets, still images, videos, or whatever, that reinforce what that storyline or what that environment is. And I think that just helps the overall experience of it.
Hmm.
Um, I want to acknowledge a question
Right.
that also came up privately in the chat. Um, is the question of venues. The nice thing about recording stuff at home is that I can listen to my nice monitor speakers. And when someone's listening to playback at home, you're just hoping that they're listening to it in a good listening environment. But I found more so when you go play live, having to maybe change the timbre to the acoustics of the room are very, very important. Again, I've talked to Steve Roach about this, and he'll show up at a venue many hours beforehand, and he'll rehearse for several hours earlier in the day, timing his delays and tweaking his reverbs and changing the EQ to match the acoustic space that he's in. He'll come with a composed idea of this is the timing of echo I want, stuff like that, but he'll change it during his rehearsal before the gig that night. And then a problem comes, people come into the audience, the sound of the room changes again, so he has to adjust on the fly. Last night, it just so happened that we had two big speakers up high, and we had a subwoofer in the room, and it sounded like maybe the crossover wasn't tuned for the subwoofer of the speakers. So this low mid range was really emphasized last night, and it makes me wish I had a very nice equalizer after my modulars, so I could have notched that out to make it sound a little bit clearer last night in the venue. That was unexpected. I was glad there was a subwoofer because I was doing a lot of really low stuff, but then it got really thick and muddy down there because the speakers and the subwoofer were covering the same audio range. So this is again making me, every time I perform is a learning opportunity. What would I do differently next time? And this is already brought in my head. Okay, I need a post EQ to equalize for the room. Don't need it in the studio when I'm assuming people are listening in a good environment at home. I'm going to need it when I go back out on the road.
Yeah, and that's that attention to detail. I mean, also when you explain what Steve is doing, I mean, and you say it's an opportunity to learn. I think that's probably for many of us who are into modular, the reason you can always, continue and never get bored with, there's obviously always a new module. We know that. So, but there's always, there's also the opportunity to learn something about how your music sounds or how it works or how people react. But now that you've included the iridium, for example, and I know you have a dark background with keyboards, let's put it that way. Some are modular purists, I'm not, and I know that you're not, we can see that also. But have you found yourself gravitating more or less towards, kind of ready-made, what can you say? Yeah, keyboards. Like in, when you look at all that, your monster case behind you, and we've talked a lot about that on some episodes once. But I'm asking because I personally sometimes feel really overwhelmed. You can see how small my stuff is here, and I even put out some modules. And I have this notion, at least, that I've learned about myself, that I can only grasp so much at the same time, and then I, on the other hand, go deep with it rather than trying to learn like 500 different modules. That I can't do that. So I'm just keen to hear if you found yourself, look, is it tempting to just get another iridium, for example, or bring a few keyboards? Or I know like Steve, he uses a lot of different gear. So how do you find yourself in that space between gear?
So the way I try to explain it for people who wonder, but I thought you were a modular synthesis. Why do you have other instruments? Is first and foremost, I love sound. I love interesting sounds. I love helping create or play with new sounds. So the sound of something is my first priority. It so happens that I find a modular synthesizer is my favorite way to create sounds because it has so many possibilities and allows me to say, I have a sound in my head, I wish it was like this and this. I can start playing with different combinations of modules to try to chase that sound down and try to create something new. It's the same thing when I'm picking what synthesizers to have over on what I call, it's kind of disassembled right now, so it's not very pretty, but what I call polysynth island.
Oh, we get a sneak peek.
Yeah. The iridium's obviously missing right now. It's on the big silver plate because it went out last night. And you'll see one of my recent acquisitions, an Ensoniq Fismo, they're leaning up against the wall. As I try not to collect keyboards, but I do pick keyboards based on, do they make a range of sounds that really resonate with me, and do they not completely overlap with something I already own? They have to have something different. So the iridium does quite a few sounds, but one of the things that really hooks me to the iridium is it does some really nice recreations of old school mellotron type sounds and things like that, which I really like from my days of listening to 70s Berlin school music and stuff like that. But like the blue box right here, the Vector synthesizer is an additive synthesis-based machine, which also does vector synthesis type crossfading. And I love its sound. The heavy drones last night were samples from the Vector. I love it for very pointillistic sequencing as well. Hydrasynth, like that as a wavetable synthesizer. Fismo has a very thick, rich sound on its own. And the way that I approach it, oh, and of course, there's a Korg wave station over there as well. There's SR in there right now because my Korg AT is getting refurbished. Um, so the way that I approach those synths is first I have to select it, did the sounds really resonate with me? Then I go through as many presets as I can find for that instrument and find which presets fill in that sound that I really like. And it may only be a small percentage of the presets that were designed for that instrument. It's not unusual for me to go through a bank of 50 presets on the wave station or the hydrosynth and maybe only find one or two sounds that I would personally use. But then I'll collect all those into a bank. So immediately I have sounds I can play. But then this gives me a head start in learning that synth of, okay, this is the range of sounds I like. How were those sounds made? And then I'll dive into how were those presets made? What tricks are they using? And that gives me a jumping off point of how to start creating my own sounds. So rather than going to an instrument completely fresh, well, I did a lot of programming with the hydrosynth. My way of shortening the learning curve with a new polysynth like that is find the sounds I like that it already does, see how those are made. Now I know what parts of the instrument to focus on to jump off and start creating my own sounds. So, which is very similar to the way that I approach the modular synth. A lot of people say, how do I look at the monster and not get intimidated by it? It's because I walk up to it saying, this is the sound I want to make right now. What modules in there are going to make that sound? And that's the way, by putting blinders on, that I don't get intimidated by all the choices. And it's the same, so I approach the modular and polysynths the same way. What are the sounds I want to create? What sections of it create those sounds? Focus on that rather than get distracted by the things inside of it.
Great. There's a question here from Dennis. If you use the vector, would you still use a keyboard, and for what?
Yeah, to load notes into our arpeggiator, the vector sequencer has what I think is a brilliant arpeggiator in that it separates the notes from the timing, which is one thing that I particularly like. You can go ahead and mute individual notes in its sequence and change the velocity of them as well. It randomizes which octave each note is played at, and it can randomize which notes are held or muted. So you can, play 4 notes into it, and it will constantly put out this evolving string of notes. But I need a keyboard to do that with. It currently does not have a built-in keyboard. They constantly update the software, and we've talked about, is there a way of doing an on-screen keyboard in there? But right now you'll see that, well, I don't have the camera over there. Right now I've got a key step in front of it, but let me walk over here and get somebody.
You're walking.
Yeah, I'm hobbling. So where's my camera?
Yeah, that's a SL Mark III.
Yeah, this is the controller keyboard I like to use because on the back it has multiple MIDI ports, and it has USB MIDI, and it has 2 pairs of CV gates. So with this controller keyboard, I'll put, for example, the Vector synthesizer in the USB out of this. I'll send the MIDI out to the MIDI patch bay over in Polysynth Island. I'll send the CV gate out to the modular system. And then on the front panel, they have these things called sessions, where I can change what session or scene I'm playing and say, okay, I change to a scene, I load new notes into the Vector's arpeggiator because it's just going out the USB. Change the scene again, now it's going out MIDI over to the Iridium. I play chords on the Iridium and things like that. So it was important to me to find a controller keyboard that allowed me to quickly change who I was controlling during a performance. And then I plug different instruments into different outputs of the controller keyboard, and that's how I quickly change what I'm doing live.
Yeah, but that's obviously also a big piece of kit bringing amongst all the other stuff.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just assumed they made a 2-octave version of that. They don't. They make a 4 or a 5-octave version of that. So probably the next big change for my gigging system, in addition to putting the ES9 into it, so now it's married to a laptop computer, is I'm going to see if I can get along with playing an Ableton Push as my keyboard controller. Because the Push already gives me a nice interface to do the virtual mixing of all the tracks. And it does have the big grid interface to play notes on, and it's very flexible in how you set up that grid. It does not have a great feel. It does not, they're
Mm.
very hard with very short throws, so it's not a pleasure to play those pads. But last time was my first time playing a pad interface to play melodic parts during a live performance, and went okay. So I want to see if I can
Mm.
use the Ableton Push and its grid layout to melodically play virtual instruments inside the laptop as part of a live performance, rather than having my normal keyboards here at home. Because that way I can just pack one thing, the flat push, and there's my mixer interface and there's my keyboard interface. If I don't get
Mm.
along with the push, I'm probably then going to try one of Roger Lynn's instruments. Yeah, Steve just popped up in the chat and said it. Yeah, that would be the next thing
Yeah.
I try. One of the performers last night, Jim Coker, has an instrument that he plays, and he was doing
Mm.
really expressive stuff using the instrument to control even his OB6. So if the push doesn't work out, then I'll go ahead and just get a virtual mixer interface like a Launchpad XL and the instrument, and that's what I'll bring out
Mm.
live. So that's where my head's at on that
It's
right now.
interesting. Interesting. I have myself acquired a Yaltex custom MIDI controller with 2 joysticks and a 4x4 encoder grid with push encoders with LED rings, and I have not utilized it yet in anything, but I have high expectations, the flexibility of that.
I'm curious to talk more about how you're playing live, because the music you've done has also evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years. You used to play underneath the name Dream Hub, and I really loved the Dream Hub work, but you've been moving further away from that into a much more abstract noise type of space with more ambient sounds. I'm curious to hear about your own evolution.
Yeah. I don't know if it's an evolution or revolution. Thanks for asking, Chris. I think I've embraced the uncertainty of modular as I see it much more, and I've kind of been leaning into it. I've kind of allowed myself to embrace, that all what can go wrong actually. And if things go wrong, I would pull up, Kenny's book. And I'm looking also at the Chick Corea book, A Work in Progress on Being a Musician, which is also very inspiring on several levels. I think for me, the work in progress is, I think it's for all of us maybe, as working with modular or instruments in general, is finding, again, what resonates with us and what keeps resonating with us. And one of my questions to you would actually be, and I want you to answer that afterwards, but what if you only could choose one instrument to do a live performance with, what that instrument would be? Because I know what it would be for me. I got the Make Noise Strega, and I could do a whole set with just that. I love it. It's I can go everywhere in an instant. Obviously, there are certain limitations, but you could also see it the other way around. So I think what I've done, and also actually when you see behind me my case up there with the handle, is the main sequencing is actually done by the Chaos, where I simply just decide the notes, the amount of notes, the range, and the what can you say, the pitch floor, whatever you'd say, the octave,
the root key
octave that it's centered around.
Yeah.
Also that the scale, or obviously you can do that also. And I have found myself, I love sequencers, you know me, I love sequencers, and I have quite a few, but I actually enjoy more and more using other sorts of modules to create the sequences, like having different LFOs feeding quantizers and probability skipper, and all that stuff also. So I found myself, I'm almost considering getting a Dope-for only system. A good old-fashioned, one knob per function. You can see obviously there's some digital modules behind me, and I think we both love that, I know, but I think I've started to embrace the subtractive synthesis thing more. I know that you have a preference for like newer sounds or wavetables and vector synthesis, obviously because of your background. But I found that I'm leaning into it. Obviously, my sets are less melodic, definitely. They are much more drone, even noisy now. So, so that's, and I've not even put anything, not much online, just a little bit. I did something with some Moog synths at some point, the semi-modulars, as you know.
Well, you're also part of the recent VCV rack focused hybrid performance.
Yeah, and that people call that jazzy, and I don't know if that's jazz or not. I didn't consider that, but it's probably because of the off grid notes, or whatever you'd call it, off scale notes here and there, and I kind of like that. That's also one thing I'm curious about your approach, Chris, because in that sense we're kind of opposite a bit. That you figure a sound in your head and then you go do it. I much more, I think, allow my explorations to show me some sounds, kind of, to discover sounds. I see it a little bit as archaeology, and that might be because I'm still kind of quote unquote young in the modular. At least I feel so still. But I think I'm wondering if you can you still get surprised, or do you?
Yeah.
Or do you want to get surprises at all?
Oh yeah, I definitely.
How's that?
I still spend time with the module that I call my research and development time, my R&D time. Right, I'm not composing a piece. I want to explore a new technique. I get an idea, or I get a new module. Like a couple ideas I explored recently, like what happens if I feed drum loops through rings, and I play with that for a couple days, and out of that came, 2 or 3 composition ideas to do later on as songs. Now getting back to Kenny Werner's effortless mastery, I've mastered the technique. Now, when it comes time to compose a song around it, oh yeah, I know how to do that. Rather than getting hung up on, how do I get that sound? It doesn't sound quite right. Excuse me, a bit of a cough right now. And also playing with filters after oscillators to track them, to go ahead and change our harmonic content.
I think that's there's stuff like that, and
I've been doing different things.
Changing the harmonic content.
Yeah, harmonic content, crossfading at audio rates. So I'll do this R&D time, which is probably the equivalent of another musician rehearsing a new technique, a new scale, a new drum pattern. But then once I'm comfortable with that, then I'll switch later on into composition mode, and I've got these things to pull on and go ahead and use. So it's not like I don't explore anymore. I just consciously make an effort of exploring before I start composing, because I don't want to get really hung up and frustrated while composing because I can't get sounds that I want, or the instrument's taking me down a dark alley that's not going to work out or something like that. So I still, I still like to experiment with it. But then when I do compose, I do try to come up with a set of ideas. Quite often it'll start even with the sound effect. And then I'll start saying, it could be a monk singing, it could be church bells. And then I'll say, what notes are in this monk's intonations or in these church bells? Okay, what scale do those notes fit into? That's the scale this piece is going to be in. And then I'll go down that path to help pre-choose for me a lot of decisions that might come up during a performance. And you asked, what's the one instrument I would take with me if I could only take one instrument? I mean, I've done solo performances with just modular, so the easy question is modular. But I really like the Waldorf Iridium, just because it is like a 16-voice stereo polyphonic kind of modular synth to me, that it has so many different synthesis techniques inside of it. It has a really robust modulation matrix. It has a sequencer, arpeggiator, and a keyboard keypad interface to play. It has layers. If I was forced to take one instrument, I'd go spend some quality time with the Iridium. But right now, I like it being paired up with the modular. I'll do the sequencing and the rhythmic patterns and on the modular, and then I'll go play on top of it using the Vector Synth or the Iridium or the Wave Station or something else like that. Korg Z1 is one of the instruments over there, things like that.
I'm then actually keen, Chris, to hear how, when you picture like a sound or a motive in your head, do you start picturing the other stuff that will surround it or support it at the same time, or how do you develop that?
Yeah, I quite often just start, again, this starts with separating practice from composition. When I am going through, say, the Korg Wave Station and auditioning patches, every day I'll say, today I'm going to just play in F minor. I need to learn the scale. And then I'll just jam with the patches in F minor while I'm auditioning patches. But during that process, motifs will start to appear of like, oh, I really like this figure I played. I like these notes together or whatever, particularly with this sound. And I'll start to develop motifs ahead of time that work particularly well with the sound. Okay, catalog that. That could be a composition later on. But then I'll spend a lot of mental time just playing it in my head and going, what would go well with that? Oh, maybe this type of rhythm. And I'll try several different rhythms. I won't say it has to be this rhythm because sometimes ideas don't work. You have to try different things to see what's going to work better with it. But then I'll imagine, oh, it'd be really a heavy bass drone, real pedal tone sort of idea would go with this. Okay, that's cataloging these things. Okay, I need to play on top of it. A choir might work on top of that. So I'll spend a lot of time composing it in my head and then go search those sounds and try those layers. And if they don't work, then I'll start saying, okay, let's start going off the original idea and try this sound instead, try this sound instead, try this sound instead. But I'll approach it with, okay, the song in my head I wouldn't mind listening to. Let's see if I can play it. And if it doesn't work out, then I'll start going off that road and trying new things.
Yeah. And I'm keen to hear then, because when you picture these, I don't know if that's the right word, picture the sounds or hear the sounds in your head and the melodies. While I just want to post also here the link to your website, aliaszone.com, where people can listen to your music. But there you describe it as tribal ambient, and how do you kind of have a framework in your head where you say, okay, the sounds have to have these qualities, because to fit into this space or this genre? How do you see that?
Yeah, my approach to composing has followed on from my approach to creating visual art. Because when I was studying to be a painter, an artist, a lot of painters start out by trying to replicate what their favorite artists do. And they'll take lessons from their favorite artists, and they'll read books by their favorite artists, and they'll try to recreate and do stuff in the styles of their favorite artists. And I encountered one book that said, what makes you think you have anything new to bring to this style?
Yeah.
And the book challenged you is that instead of trying to recreate what someone else is doing, think about what are your interests and your strengths and come up with a new art style based on your interests and what you're good at, rather than trying to replicate what someone else is already doing. And in my case, I came with combining abstract photography with collage, with some printmaking techniques, and I came up with, I think, a relatively unique blend of stuff. And that was very liberating. I could do abstract acrylic collages all day long, but they would look like 5,000 other artists trying to do abstract acrylic collage. It was important for me to say, I'm interested in mythology, I'm interested in archaeology, I'm interested in such and such, I'm interested in photography. Let's make something out of those elements. So then when I started moving from doing visual art back into doing music 5-6 years ago, I took the same approach. What am I interested in? I really like tribal rhythms and ethnic instruments. I really like complex timbral drones from synthesizers. I really like Berlin school sequences. I really like ambient sound recordings. Okay, let's make music using those elements, as opposed to, I'm going to try to do techno just like this person who already has been doing it for 10 years, and I will never be as good as that person doing that because they have a head start. Instead, I said, what are the sounds and types of music that I like to listen to? Let's use those to make my music. That's just how I've been trying to approach it myself.
I think that's a really great approach. When I've been teaching graphic design to students, I've occasionally had someone say, I want to do something that the world has never seen before. And what do they end up with? Something the world has seen 1,000 times before.
Yeah.
And I can't help thinking of, when you tell this, of Picasso, because he started out replicating, Renaissance style, whatever, painting what he saw really, like realistically. And then, as we all know, he evolved his artistic language in different ways and through his time. Do you think you're, or do you have any plans, even consciously, or do you think you unconsciously maybe might drift in some direction down the line? Or or have you already seen yourself gravitate towards certain styles or sounds or elements?
Oh yeah, it has really changed already. Like pre-pandemic, I was doing very rhythmically heavy stuff. Ambiances, found spoken words, heavy rhythms,
Hmm.
usually polyrhythmic, usually trying to layer a Western rhythm like a drummer with something that's ethnic, something from the Far East, something's from Africa, and create these hybrids. And that's what I did.
Hmm.
And then when the pandemic came, and in particular when David Soto asked me to play in one of his first space music things online, October Skies, it was suddenly hit with, oh, that's not going to work in this context. What else do I like? Well, I like Berlin School. What other things do I like?
Hmm.
So I started, I let go of the percussion elements and said, let's go to sequencer dominated music and explore that for a while because there's another interest that I have. Let's see where that takes me. Now, after I started doing
Hmm.
that, I've been introducing the drums back in again. And then, like last night, for me was an exciting thing because it was the first time that I married the rhythmic heavy side that you did pre-pandemic with the more sequenced, although randomized, and chordal
Hmm.
passages that I've been doing since the pandemic. And last night was the first time I put the two of them together. And for me, that was an exciting thing. Like, could I marry those styles? I always had in my
Hmm.
head, like, I want to do Berlin School, but with African drumming or something like that. But I've never got to that point. Um, and now, like, okay, this is going to be a rich area to explore for a while. It's still in my cloud of things that I like to listen to, but it's a new combination of them. And as I listen to
Yeah.
other things, I listen to other music, and that gets added into. Oh, I like that style. Let's mix some of that into what I'm doing.
Hmm. I think at this point it'd be great for people to just maybe add in the chat what some of their musical influences are.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you also, Chris, there's something recently, like I know you've interacted with younger modular musicians too. Are there any one you feel inspired by and feel that now there's something new coming?
Uh,
Um,
there's just so much great music. What I like about modular is that it's broken people from the normal musical conventions, and people feel they can do whatever they
hmm,
want to. So I'm hearing some great stuff come out of like Indonesia. Bassfoot does some fantastic mixing of traditional Indonesian stuff with a modular synth. That's something that really perked my ears recently, for example. Um, I like listening to a lot of the noise and heavy rhythmic bass stuff and the hard techno. I can't imagine myself doing it because other people already do it very well. So why should I go off and do
yeah.
that? Um, but it's kind of interesting because I seem to have mixed a lot of older school influences into stuff. I was a really big fan of Bill Laswell, who was a bassist who always mixed together
Hmm,
different influences, ethnic, jazz, rock, funk, and would do these different combinations. State Azor said
hmm,
someone brought up a beautiful, he just is
yeah.
beautiful,
Yeah.
really log form stuff. Various Todd Barton says it's it's one of those interesting things. I always try to, even if I don't necessarily like the music, I say, what's an interesting element of this music that I could meld into my music? And when I
Hmm,
talk with someone like Steve Roach, I love Steve's music, but every time that I go in front of the synthesizers, I end up not doing Steve Roach music. You know, maybe something he's done with a sequencer has influenced me, but it's through my filter and I'm doing something different with it. So
hmm.
I'm always trying to get some new influences, um, and then just seeing is there an element of that that would be fun to mix into what I'm doing.
Hmm. Yeah. Have you, there's a question from Dennis here, another interesting question that with a picture synth from FL Studio 20 years ago. Is there something similar for the modular world? I don't know, Dennis, if you were at Superbooth recently, probably not, maybe, but there was actually one guy who had developed a picture synth for modular for several decades. He's been developing it. I don't know if it will ever be what do you call it, commercial product, but I think at the Synth Anatomy, Tom's website, you can see a video there, I think. Maybe we can find the
I
link.
remember seeing that, right. And also there's been people trying to
Mm,
revive Daphne Orum's orophonics thing of painting gestures
yeah,
and running that through a scanner.
yeah.
I, I worked back on the Prophet VS ages ago, and we were trying to develop new waveforms for it. And I'll, we had different tools we had made, including the ability to draw waveforms. And we were always quite disappointed that
Mm,
drawing didn't turn out to sound the way that we thought it was going to sound. Yeah, this is a cool shape, it's noise. This is a cool shape, more
mm, mm.
noise. So, but um, boy, in the modular world, it'd be fun to see some stuff that was more abstracted, like Metasynth or whatever, appear as modules. Now
Mm,
that more
mm.
stuff is being, now that more touch screens are appearing on digital modules, I think that'd be a really fun thing to start to see.
Yeah, I think that maybe one thing that oh, sorry, I kicked something here. Uh, one thing that I would say is, and probably that even you could explore when you start using Ableton Live again, is Max MSP. Max has a lot of stuff you can do with image recognition via the camera from the computer or attach some cams, and there's a lot of stuff going on in that scene or that world. So I think attaching that to something like the ES9 or something else, you have control over your modular.
Yeah,
So you can wave your hand in front of your webcam and you can control your filter or whatever. That's very, yeah, likely
yeah,
doing it that
and
way.
it's kind of interesting because right now I have even more interest in going the other direction of how to start creating visuals driven by my music, as opposed to
Mm,
necessarily creating music driven by the visuals. Because I'm trying to like, how do I make live performances or pre-recorded performances more interesting? Um,
mm,
so I think that's one thing that adding the computer more into the setup is going to open up more of that and start bringing in some VJ tools on the laptop as well to have a little bit more
mm.
control. I'm going to see if I have enough mental bandwidth to do the video as well as the music live.
But I think some of your recent videos on your YouTube channel, Alias Zone channel, shows, I guess, what's also kind of a symptom from, or whatever you call it, from the pandemic, that people are performing at home and they start buying blue lights and purple lights and jazz up their studios. And I
Yeah,
think it's great because I think there's been created some, and also, as Lance wrote here, State Assure is doing that a lot with blue lights, and he has his own style in that. And I know you've done a little bit of that
yeah.
too.
Yeah,
And how do you find that?
I've got RGB
Mm.
floodlights installed throughout the
Oh,
studio that I can control and change the lighting of. Um,
oh,
and I'll be using that on the next video I create. Actually, is trying to create more another environment. Because I'm going to take the piece I performed last night and do a studio version of it, including a studio video for
nice.
it. So that's one of the next things
Mm.
that's got to come.
And you're also doing some other studio work for something coming up in Europe in the near future,
Yeah,
right?
actually, I'm going to do the studio version of last night's performance for SoundMit, which is going to be broadcast middle November. And then I'm going to actually
Mm.
take a video performance of a modular piece I had done earlier, and I'm going to be a Dublin modular the first weekend in November, playing back the video of the performance, but then actually dissecting it live and taking questions and answers from people at the double modular group about how the piece came together and stuff like that. So that's going to be fun.
Okay, that sounds great, actually. Have you any collaborations that are coming up or planned or you wish to do in the future?
This is the case where the pandemic screwed things up. Pre-pandemic, I had lots of collaborations. A lot of people don't know, for example, Kim and I have never played together, but we both want to play together. And we actually had scheduled
Mm.
to play together at Perfect Circuit Audio in Pasadena right before a Synthfest show out there. Um,
Mm.
but it got canceled from the pandemic, and we couldn't do that. And
Yeah.
I had already booked on that trip. I'm going to go visit Joe Frazier, Richard Bugg, and Travarsi, and I'm going to go jam with all of them. Then I'm going to,
Mm.
and then when we look like we're coming out of the pandemic again, I had already booked trips up into Colorado to play with the Colorado gang, then to go down to Tucson and play with the Arizona gang, and then then I broke a leg. um, so, and that's been one of the interesting things for me is the pandemic forced me to get out of this mode of like I'm just going to collaborate with a bunch of friends to see if an album comes out of it. To like I've got to make,
Mm.
I'm on my own. I got to make stuff on my own now.
Yeah.
um, but I still look forward, to playing with you. We keep talking about collaborating in some way, and you're going through a big
Yeah.
move into a new space. I hope it's going to be more conducive to you making more music, and hopefully we can do
I
some
hope so
collaboration
too.
that way. And I'm looking forward. I'm still
Mm.
planning. I have a few friends I do want to make music with, but it's been liberating for me this past year and a half to face up to, can you do it yourself? And
Mm,
that
mm,
that's been a real interesting thing to stare down. And it's taken me a year to get comfortable with the idea of making solo music, and that what I'm doing is different
mm.
than maybe that other people are playing, and not feeling bad that it's not like what other people are doing, and to get over that.
Yeah, yeah, just get over it.
Yeah.
I think that that's the interesting thing about playing with others or playing by yourself, that contrast. I mean, if you play alone, you can take the piece wherever you want to, whenever you want to. You might not be able to do that when playing with someone else, but on the contrary, you have these moments where everything just is magic, right? When you have that connection with the other performer, and it just, you create that special moment. It can be 1 minute, it can be 10 minutes, it can be an hour, whatever. But and I think that's what probably a lot of us long for somehow. Again, playing music with others. How did you experience last night when other people playing before you? How was that, seeing live music, modular live music again,
It was
up
nice.
close?
It's easy to forget how nice it is to see the reaction of other human beings while you're creating.
Hmm.
And I think that was the nice thing for a lot of people, was to get that feedback from something other than themselves or maybe their spouse while they're playing music.
Yeah.
Um, and it's fun. You can watch a video, but there's something different about being in the same room and having a three-dimensional view of someone going through the struggle of performance and creation, as opposed to just watching a video
Hmm.
of them do it. There's something a little, I've noticed that at sporting events. A sporting event on TV is different than a sporting event in the stadium. And I'm noticing the same
Hmm.
thing about watching people play, watching people go through the joy and the struggle of creating in front of you is a nice
Hmm.
experience. And that was really nice to experience last night, and then to be around other people as
That's
well. So that was fun.
hmm. That's so great to hear. Like, I just want to say to people, we know you're all out there, so remember to put some questions in. Um, and we'd love to hear what you think, and if you have any questions for Chris. I have one question, Chris, more for you. I love to talk about modular performance. I know we have a book we could talk about also, but I
We
want to,
should.
in relation to what you just said, yeah, we should. I just have one interesting question. I think it's interesting, at least. I want to hear your response to this. Seeing people create in front of you. I experienced Mark Verber's patching from scratch, in Berlin once while
Yeah.
his 909 playing.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see people in the back of the room, this techno plays, they were just dancing, they just felt the beat. But up in front, all the nerds were, and I was there, obviously, checking out what he was doing, and he was patching live, and you know, and that was so interesting from that perspective, I think. But have you ever felt the urge to do something like that, like pull out all the cables and just patch some stuff up? Or
That I am of two different minds of that. On the one hand, when I go play with other people, I'm in complete improvise mode, and I will live
hmm,
patch, and I will have a lot of the Q headphones on quite often, and like, does this work? Okay, let's try this sound, and just furiously repatch and try new sounds live. So when I improvise with other people, and I joke, that's easy for me. That's my happy space. Is just to say, okay,
great.
what's the tempo? Um, let's go. What are you doing? And then just to live patch and pull up new
Hmm,
sounds. I oddly find that easy to do, and I find it much harder to do the solo pieces. And maybe because I'm just so self-conscious of it, or I don't know if it's right to say, I feel like the weight or the burden of it. But when I'm
hmm,
creating my own pieces, I like, okay, I want this to match the ideal in my head, and it's going to be a lot more.
hmm,
I'll rehearse it ahead of time. I leave sections in every piece to improvise, but I'm not live patching. I'm live
Hmm.
modifying stuff I've set up ahead of time, and even letting the machine do some chance operations and things like that, and reacting to that. But when I'm playing my own pieces, I guess they're a bit more precious to me to communicate this concept in my head, as opposed to when I'm improvising with others. I'm just like, it's the joy of responding at the moment and creating new things.
Hmm.
How about you?
Yeah, being in the moment
I
also.
mean,
I love improvising. I almost never compose anything anymore, but that will change when I go more back to my computer actually.
yeah.
But when using modular, obviously I patch up before. I'm saying obviously, but I do actually. But then I really only have like an image in my head of, how do I want to begin? What pinnacles do I want through the piece, and how do I want to end it somehow?
Mhm.
And then I stretch back and forth, you compress or stretch it out from
Mhm.
that and go in all different directions, and it never ends up the way I intended. And I kind of like that because otherwise I think I would bore myself. And I remember a recent gig I did actually was somewhat like this case. I've taken out a few modules, but it was in a small space where people was standing up, and there was like maybe 30 people or so, 30, 40 people maybe, and a lot of them were new to modular. And before, earlier than me, a young guy was playing some tracks. Like then he played a 2.5 minute track, and then it was done, and people applauded. And then a new track. It's very like structured, but also very in my world, it felt a little bit abrupt. I like to create the soundscape and an atmosphere and a space for people to dwell in and be absorbed by.
Mhm.
And so that's the approach I took. And I was taking some deep breaths, before doing this set, and just going with it. And I really, what do you say, dwelt on notes and on filter sweeps, whatever I did. And I like to do that, and then I kind of build it up steadily over like 20 minutes or so. And then when I ended, I just cut it off like that. And that was like leaving people hanging in the air. That was so interesting also for me, because it was so massive in the end, like so much going on, weaving in and out. And I really like to build that kind of tension. It's almost like one big build up, and that was interesting to me to try that out also. I've done it one time before that also. And you hear some ambient musicians doing that, like R. Benny, for example. He used that a lot with more saturation or distortion during the tracks. And but in my environment, I just like to weave things in and out also, and to create these empty spaces in between.
Yeah,
And I think it's
yeah,
probably the same approach as you.
yeah. I find that I almost like doing like a magician's sleight of hand sometimes, or like we changed. Did you notice? Um,
Yeah.
and suddenly
Suddenly you're in another place.
we're in a different place. I didn't hear that transition. I like conjuring
Yeah.
smooth transitions where suddenly
Hmm.
the fog rolls in and then we're in a different place. So I work
Yeah.
on that a lot more than abrupt stuff and things like that. So that's fun.
Yeah. I've enjoyed a lot using this guillotine from Ritual Electronics, the
Hmm.
distortion module,
Oh yeah, I
which
don't
is
know
a
that
stereo
one.
distortion module.
Okay.
And I actually pan it around in my Cosmotronics mixer up here, the Cosmics, which also can add saturation or drive. Um, and doing, having the same drone, for example, going into the two stereo channels with different amounts of saturation, that creates almost like a 3D space sometimes. And that's something I've enjoyed doing a lot, because people are like, "Oh, where's this coming from? What's going on?" And then it crosses over and all that stuff. Um, yeah, so quad, I can't wait, and I can't wait to hear your next thing in quad.
Yeah,
Um,
that'll be a new space to explore. I'm, you know,
definitely.
there's the excitement and trepidation both getting into that. One thing we promised.
But I mean, also,
Go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I mean, also we should probably kind of loop back to also what we promised
I have to
people
say, we
and
promised that we were going to talk a little bit
Atmos.
about a new project that we were involved with together. Well, Atmos is another
Yeah.
multi-dimensional sound. You shouldn't even be thought of.
Mm.
Um, I'm sure more live Atmos mixing equipment will inevitably pop up. Right now we have to deal with the tools that we were given, and modular, just finding quad panners is a hard thing to do right now. Um, the one that
Mm.
Coma made has been discontinued. Um, Shackmat started doing some quad tools and things like that. So unfortunately,
Mm.
modular musicians to a large degree are somewhat. Oh yeah, Planar 2 is a great tool. I have one over there on the Polysynth Island actually. Um, you know, Atmos tools, I really look forward to that. I would love to have an interface where I can spatially place things rather than have to think very technically front or back and things like that. So that'd be a cool tool.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting is that with panning sounds around, one thing is taking one sound and panning it around. But if you have like 20 sounds going on at the same time, that can become quite a few planar modules in your system. And and so there are different approaches, I think, also to this. But yeah, we'll get to the book now, I think, and that's, I think it's interesting. We kind of end this conversation, or this is the point where we go to the book, because we're talking about quad, because that's also technology, and you've of anyone, like, I mean, you've been through a lot of different technological advancements through your time with synths, and you've actually been involved very heavily with vector synthesis yourself.
Yeah.
And that's why I called upon you on the new book, which is called Synth Gems.
Yeah.
And maybe you can. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was very fortunate back in the '80s to work at
Mm,
synthesizer manufacturers like Sequential during a time when we were changing from analog subtractive synthesis for the most part to
mm,
wavetable, sampling, digital synthesis. That all those changes started coming in pretty much within a decade, and it was really it was a fun time as a creator and a scary time as a manufacturer to navigate this nice safe world of everyone making a variation on a subtractive analog synth to there's all these new ways of making sound. How do we put those into an instrument and which ones are going to catch on? Um, and
mm,
there was a lot of, like the first days of polyphony, there was a lot of different things being tried in the 70s of how do you go from a monophonic synthesizer to a polyphonic synthesizer. And there was lots of different
mm,
approaches. Organ style approach of the Korg PS series, for example, or other instruments. Um, the individual module, sound module approach of the Oberheim systems. Um, and until
mm,
Dave Smith came out with the Prophet 5. And a lot of people said, oh, that's the way to do it. So
mm.
it's been so the 70s to go to polyphony, the 80s to get out of analog. The synthesizer is a young instrument anyway compared to piano, violin, guitar,
Mm.
drums. It has a really, really short history
Yeah.
compared to all these other instruments. But then to think of the massive changes that happened in just those couple of decades in the past is for me fascinating.
Yeah, definitely is. And my next question, I will actually ask, and you can answer it while I will show people the book. At least, let's see if I can find it now. I'll go to my web browser and just share where we're showing the new book.
There we go.
Yeah. And because my question to you, yeah, it didn't keep us from writing about vintage synthesizers, though it's still fairly young instrument. But I mean, we took this approach of like more than 20 years old, then it's vintage. And this book is written by Mike Medley, whom we both know very well, and you are among the editors. So when you look back and you had the chance editing this book, or also diving into some of the old technologies again, when you look back on all this, what are some obvious misses during synth history so far.
Hmm.
And while you think about that, I'll browse a little bit through the book so people
That's an
can get
interesting
a look
question.
at.
Where did people get it wrong? Um, I there. Well, I worked in sequential circuits, so I'm very familiar with some of the pains we were going with at sequential at the time. And one of the things that
Hmm.
sequential kind of went through was like, how many oscillators should a synthesizer voice have? And
Hmm.
one of the people who worked on the Prophet 5 was John Bowen, who came from Moog Music. And his feeling was, well, obviously three, like a mini Moog. And Dave Smith is saying that that's too many parts in a polyphonic synth. Um, so it had to be two per voice. But then when sequential was getting pressured by people making, how do you make a synthesizer less expensive? One way was to drop the number of oscillators. So we went to a lot of one
Hmm.
oscillator per voice instruments, and sequential tried that for a while, actually using a chip that was designed for video games. Doug Curtis designed what we called the Bally Synth chip for Bally video games that had one VCO, one VCF, a VCA, all in one piece of silicon. And then the LFOs and envelopes were done in software. And Sequential did a few instruments based on that idea, trying to get the costs down to like a Korg Poly 800 and things like that. And the absolute worst miss that Sequential ever did was an instrument called the Max. So marketing and Sequential came up with this idea of, we're going to do the boys in the band. We have a drum machine called Tom. We have a keyboard called Max. And Max was a one VCO per voice, all preset instrument, as attempt to get as cheap as possible with like a 2-digit LED display and like a couple buttons, and that was it. And that was definitely a low point in Sequential's history. Um, but I think in general,
Interesting.
a new technology comes out, and sometimes people get focused on the technology rather than how to make it musical. And I think that's where we end up in dead ends. Um,
Hmm.
and that's where we get breakthroughs like, Yamaha making FM first into almost basically a preset instrument, and then finding different ways of making it more programmable. Particularly, a lot of people like the Korg Op 6 today as a way of making a very programmable FM synth. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know.
So what were? Yeah, I'm just
I'm curious what you
now
think
I
the
just
obvious misses were. You asked me the question. You have to answer it too.
I'm too young for answering that. I feel way too young. That's one of the few occasions I can say that, I think. But I'm not sure. I'm totally not sure. There was one here, like Perfy saying, was it wrong to add a keyboard? And I don't think so, because the synthesizers would not have had that popularity as they got, if a keyboard wasn't attached to it. I
There,
think.
that's a really
Uh,
interesting discussion, actually, that happened a lot
hmm,
in the days of Moog and Buchla. Um,
yeah.
Don Buchla was a piano
There's
player.
here.
Don Buchla had a
Hmm,
piano in his home. So it's not
hmm,
like Don was completely against keyboards. On the other hand, Bob Moog did not want to put a keyboard on his modular.
hmm,
And Herb Deutsch, who he collaborated with on the earliest Moog synthesizers, said, well, one,
hmm,
it's going to make it a lot more accessible. But two, he said, what's the most recent advance in contemporary classical music is serial music, and that was done on a keyboard. So the keyboard didn't hold back people from coming up with a new music form. It's not going to be a hindrance, was Herb Deutsch's approach. And
hmm,
even Alan Perlman did not want to put a keyboard on his early ARP instruments. And people like Vladimir Ushevsky said, yeah, you have to put a keyboard on it, even though Ushevsky did very
hmm,
abstract electronic music at Columbia. So I know there's this tendency to break into camps about keyboard destroyed what the synthesizer could do, and it certainly
hmm.
made it an instrument that people said, I can go play a solo, I can just comp on it, I can play it like an organ, I can play it like a piano, and that certainly did happen. But I think it's unfair to say that the keyboard stopped people from being creative with it. You could still be creative
Hmm.
with the keyboard attached to it. Although, a accordion interface on a synthesizer, that's might be where I draw a line. And there was like one instrument that did not make it in, but is a feature on the spread in the very back of the book, of an
There's a
accordion.
surprise for people. Yeah.
Yeah, an accordion interface on a synthesizer where you have to go, Okay, yes, accordions were big in Italy.
Yeah.
I guess that made sense to you.
Yeah. But there are some countries that are very big on accordions.
Yeah.
Maybe not the US, maybe not in Europe, but certain like South America. There are some parts of the world
Yeah, I
which
bring a Western
that's
keyboard prejudice to that, I admit.
mm. I'm keen on you know me. I love weird interfaces and just alternative approaches to playing your instruments, and I kind of can't get enough of grid controllers, and it's interesting you said the people mentioned the monome, and which I have an MPC-1 lying around which I'm very keen to hook up to my modular because it has actually 8 CV gate outs. It actually has like 4 stereo pairs out, and you can configure them as you want to. And it has the touch screen and the touch sensitive pads, and it doesn't take up as much space as your SL Mark III. But well, I'll report back to you on how that goes.
Well, that's
But
the,
when you've been
go ahead.
looking,
Go ahead.
yeah, sorry, yeah, I was just keen on you've been really have been a really great resource and help in editing this book because you also had a lot of contacts, and we've put a lot of effort in getting the right sources to talk about these things, because there's a lot of let's just call it fake news out there about synthesizers and synth history. So we've tried with this book to set things right, and as some of you might see, there's a 1 behind Gems. This is the Synth Gems 1, and it's also because we can't put every synth in this book, because that would be a 5,000 page book, I guess, or the images would be very small. And I just want to mention to those listening and seeing this that we've tried to do something different here and allowing each synth to get a lot of space and really show in detail with great photography, custom photography, the details and the functional and aesthetic beauty of these synths and the way they're laid out, and while also describing a great deal of synth history actually in this book. Was there something here that surprised you reading it
I think
in particular?
there's definitely a few things that surprised me, and then I want to get back on what you talked about user interface, because I think there's some lessons from these old synths that could be applied to modulars today. In terms of surprise, I think for me the biggest surprise was hearing that Tom Oberheim did not design the SEM, the synthesizer expander module, because I always assumed that was all from Tom's head. And in the early days of the book, when we were researching it, it came to, well, Dave Rossum was involved. Was he? Let me call up Dave and find out what's going on. And then Dave said,
Yeah.
well, you should also, did you know that Dennis Collin of ARP was involved? No, I didn't. So that was for me the biggest range of surprises. But there was some fun stuff in there, and I think it points out that in these early days of the synthesizer, people were also figuring out how were people going to perform it, not just the keyboard interface, but also like left-hand controllers, and watching the evolution of wheels, joysticks, pressure-sensitive pads, all these things on the left-hand controllers that evolved. And one of my funner stories in the book is a classic instrument is the Steiner Parker Synthicon. Most people know the Synthicon today because its filter is a core component of many of Arturius synthesizers, Niall Steiner's filter design. But one of the other odd features of the Synthicon was that it's laid out backwards. The oscillators are on the right, and the VCA is on the left, more of a guitar pedal layout rather than most synthesizers with the VCO and the voice going left to right on it. And a lot of people just said, well, that's odd, but Niall Steiner's still alive. So, we got in touch with Niall and said, why did you do that? And he said he figured when people were playing the keyboard, what controls were they going to go for while they were playing? And his feeling was they're probably going to go less for the oscillators and more for things like LFOs and envelopes in the VCA. So he put the VCA and the envelopes down on the left side to be by your hand. And you'll notice here, it says keyboard right on the leftmost controls, then sample and hold, and then you have the envelope generator. And he put the oscillators by the right hand, figuring you set those up ahead of time. You don't need to touch those while playing. but there's other performance controls that should be by your left hand, and that's why he laid out that panel backwards. Uh, so that's one interesting piece of history. But there's lots of interesting instruments in here, like the Syrinx, for example, with its very interesting, very sensitive touchpad interface. The Nord lead with its unusual wheel and bender controls. And one of my,
I'll just browse a little bit around the book.
Yeah, go ahead and bring up some of those spreads.
Yeah.
And
I just mentioned that the Vince Clarke wrote the foreword. You guys probably know him. So
yeah, that's great to get Vince to
and
do.
These so
and
yeah, it just continue, Chris. I'll find Syrinx.
So I think it's interesting that so many of those instruments in the early days put so much emphasis on the performance aspect of it, and you don't see a lot of that with modular today. There are definitely all sorts of fun controllers, touchpad interfaces, pressure points, joystick controls like planar, and things like that available. But my feeling is we're in the second wave of modular synthesizer composition and performance. And I think a lot of people are still learning how to play a modular synthesizer. And right now, there's a lot of emphasis on merely triggering a note from a sequencer, arpeggiator, etc., and then having an interesting timbre come out. But I think too few of us have gotten to the point of like, how do I evolve that note while it's playing? And I would like to see more things like the Syrinx's controllers, or like the very tactile interfaces on the Nord lead for its bender control and its wheel. I'd like to see more of those things migrate into modular synthesizers so that we could spend more time on how a note evolves rather than just triggering a note and then having it trigger an interesting timbre that plays out through envelopes. And I think that's a lesson from the earlier synths of, the VL1, with the two ordinary wheels and what are called the log, that big cylindrical wheel that also has a ribbon controller built into it. I'd love to see more of these things become standard controllers for modular synths so that we could focus more on evolving notes rather than just triggering notes. And that's kind of a personal beef of mine. And I admit myself,
I think that
I'm using random, slow, random, smooth, random sources to do that rather than playing them. I admit I have a weakness myself, but that's why something like a instrument for a controller is very interesting, is how can I start adding more inflection into notes?
Yeah, definitely. We have seen some of these attempts doing gestural controls, for example, like the Icelandic Genki ring, the wave ring, which was one of the
touche, things like that.
Yeah. Also the touche, but the wave ring, they have a Eurorack module, so which directly interacts with the ring, which is quite interesting, I think. But also there are these more, like we see stuff come out with these physical, like particles you can bounce around, for example. Anything that comes to mind in the modular world that kind of resembles that?
There's a few modules that have either game systems or physics built into them. And they're kind of rare, but now that we're seeing like touch screens and entire Linux computers as a module these days, I think we're going to see more of these physics-based systems start to appear inside modular. So you can start playing around with things like gravity, wind, and controlling parameters of that, and then letting a natural force or physics evolve it, rather than having that very direct knob control on precisely what the sound is doing. As you've seen from the way that I add chance operations and random into my performances, I'm very interested in the idea of setting up systems, not just generative patches, but even physics-based stuff like what's wind like, what's gravity like, what's surf like, waves, not just an LFO, but something that simulates, say, surf, and making that a controller and being able to control the parameters of the surf and then having that drive my synth voice. I think that's an interesting possible way to go down the road.
Yeah, I think the last one I showed here was the JD800 with all the faders on it, and I think it comes back to this you could say interesting discussion or just notion, that how much hands-on do we need or want in a live performance when using our modular systems. It would be interesting to hear what people in the chat and maybe later on also in the comments, what you see are interesting performance options with your modular. And I think, Chris, your way of using the acoustic percussion instruments adds really an interesting performance aspect. Is that something you consciously think about when you think about using that instrument, or does the sound come first, or how is that for you?
In that case, the sound comes first. I've been collecting
Hmm.
percussion instruments for 30 years now, and each one I've bought is because it makes an interesting sound to my ears. And so when I
Hmm.
drag them out as part of a modular performance, it's because I want that sound element. I'm also conscious of the performance aspect. Um, a electronic music concert can be a boring thing to watch, particularly the way a lot of people set up with the gears backplate facing the audience, and the audience
Hmm.
unable to
Hmm.
see what the performer is doing. And I do think one of our obligations, opportunities as musicians is to make electronic music more accessible by making it clearer to the audience that we are indeed interacting with the instrument and we are causing sounds to change. So for me, there are certain theatrical
Hmm.
aspects of it's fun to bring out the hand percussion and just to have a microphone and do a Doppler shift it by a microphone. People get to see me do a grand gesture and also hear a sound change. And same thing as
Hmm.
I tend to perform with my back to the audience just so they can see all the controls and they can see me adjusting the synthesizer.
Hmm.
Um, so but the sound comes first. It has to be an
Yeah.
instrument
Yeah.
that I like the sound of, and then I see a way to make it more interesting. Like one change I made in my performance system last night, the photo you first showed, the black box was on the table by my knees. And I thought, people can't see I'm pressing a button down here, literally off screen as far as they're concerned. So I put it up on a
Hmm.
mic stand boom up here so that I had to reach up to do it, and you could see the display of the black box. And I originally did that.
Hmm.
The black box was there because it had sounds I needed to play. I put it up here so the audience could then see that I was playing those sounds.
Hmm.
That was kind of the mental process. It ended up being really convenient to have a heads up display up. There's the bar and beat. Here's the bar line I'm coming up on. Here's
Hmm.
the status of the loops of all these sounds. That it ended up being great to have it right there. But that was a mental process. I need these sounds.
Yeah.
How can I make the audience know that I'm making these sounds?
I'm kind of thinking way back to Keith Emerson with his smoke system. Imagine he turned it, the other way around. Not he had it to the side, right? So or at least angled somehow so people could see. Imagine he was behind it, nobody could see him then.
Yeah.
So there's definitely, thing in the performative aspect. Like Susanne Chani also, sometimes she's in the middle of the room performing, and people stand close to her all the way around.
One thing we did last night is we had a camera, a projector, and a screen. And we had the camera person say, get the best view of the gear and the person performing the gear
Mm,
so we can put it up on the screen for the audience to see what was going on. And when we were talking to the
mm,
people at Currents last night about what we might end up doing next year, one of the venues we've talked about is getting a theater setting where it's kind of like a three-quarter in the round where you have people around you and elevated so they can look down on what you're doing.
yeah.
And I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I remember seeing Herbie Hancock in Copenhagen in a concert hall where I luckily said I had it planned a bit, so I could look directly down on his keyboards on the left side, and that was just amazing watching his interaction all night. And I'm thinking that the seeing how the instrument, because it's electronic instruments, obviously they don't have the same, you know. You usually don't bring them or drag them around stage like you would do with a guitar or violin, whatever. And so I think you're right. You mentioned obligation slash desire or
Opportunity.
you know opportunity, yeah, to show people. I remember Daedalus. He had this kind of half transparent, half opaque case, which was tilted the other way around towards the audience, and it had lights inside also. That was an interesting way of doing it, and people were quite excited because it looked like a magic box, with all the wires.
Yeah.
So
There's
have you
a
been thinking about?
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple acts that have done things like that. There's a Canadian act whose name I now forget, who put all their interfaces tilted this way towards the
Mm,
audience that they would reach over and play, so the audience could see either mostly iPads, and they would light up
mm,
when they press different squares on it. And we saw Thomas
mm,
Dolby play at Synthplex a couple years ago solo, and he put a lot of the stuff up on the stage where you could see him playing it,
mm.
and then had the projection screen as well. And I think that's particularly great.
Yeah, yeah. It kind of the opposite of Kraftwerk in the recent years, I guess, which is standing behind desks, waiting for, like they're servicing people. So maybe this is, I feel like we're talking a lot, Chris, and
Yeah,
there's
and
been some really good questions.
we've been coming up in a couple hours. We should probably wrap this up eventually so people can get on with their day. But any final questions people were curious to ask either Kim or myself before we wrap up for the day? Feel
Yeah,
free
it'd be
to.
great to hear from you. We hope you've enjoyed it at least. I have, Chris. It's always interesting to talk about these things, and yeah, we could go on forever.
As you can
But
probably
yeah, raise
tell,
your hands. Okay.
the two of us, Kim and I, became really good friends while writing Patch and Tweak, and this is like our
Yeah.
conversations quite often.
Yeah, yeah. Just a short conversation, and then it's 2 hours. Yeah. Thanks for the great question, Todd. I'm happy you look forward to Synth Gems. I appreciate that. It's what's next? Yeah, there are actually quite a lot of projects in the works, and printed circuits are that's an interesting thing too. We don't have a plan like that coming up, but I could say that yeah, Chris and I have enjoyed working on Patch and Tweak also. So and we still love Modular, though he has an Iridium now. But so you never know. And Patch and Tweak can make noise. Yeah, that could be. Yeah, patching and tweaking further. Maybe you saw the Moog book coming out also. I enjoyed doing that, working with semi-modular actually. It felt a bit to me like cheating a bit, but coming back to instruments. Oh, yes,
Thanks, Lance.
that's great. Thank you so much, Lance. We appreciate that. I think the best thing is also seeing you here, all of you, and these conversations we can have around music and technology, and that's what I hope to spark with the books from Bjooks. And I think that's, Chris, it seems that's dear to your heart also. I won't say preaching, but talking about the instruments we use and how we use them and how we could use them maybe.
Yeah, I love sharing. I
Um,
mean, for me, it's all about learning and then sharing what you've learned. And for me, that's one of the things I love most about the modular synthesis world in particular, is I feel that
mm,
particularly this rebirth we've had since the 90s, that it's the second life of modular and we're still very young and it's fun watching it evolve and what can we do and where can we take it. And it's been fascinating for me
mm,
to see people like creating, I think, all these new music genres with the modular, this almost continuum from noise through melodic, beat through abstract. And when you think that people have only been doing this in some cases for 1 or 2 or 3 years, how far are they
mm,
going to take it? And I think one of the evolutions we've seen is also people are now getting, you know, more of us know how to create sounds with our modular. Now we're focusing more on composing and performing with it. The pandemic really accelerated that with people doing virtual performances, now wonderful things like the modular world. So for me, I'm just really
mm.
excited to see this young instrument and its users evolving in real time right in front of us and seeing where we're going.
Yeah, I can only agree. Stephen is suggesting a new genre, Soyacore. I guess that's the Soya.
Well, you work with just the Zoya,
So
but then there's going to be another one. See, that's the problem with making something module specific. Then there's another cool module a couple months later.
yeah, but there's this tendency to modules, computers within modules or the modular within modules. I think it's interesting to see where that goes, as opposed to the more old school approach.
Well,
Uh,
also putting a computer inside a module, but keeping the UI flat enough to still be as attractive as using a normal module. Like a lot of people know I'm a big
mm,
fan of the vector sequencer, but one of the reasons is that its user interface was so reminiscent of an old school analog sequencer, and that it had a lot of
mm,
displays rather than a very small display that I had to keep paging through to see what was going on. And I think that's the challenge for a lot of designers. People can write fantastic code how do you make it an instrument for people to play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an instrument. Yeah, coming back to the instrument again.
Yeah.
So this has been a great chat. I think it's been great seeing you all and getting your questions. Thank you so much. So Chris, I guess we have to round this off.
Yeah.
So
On to
I
new
feel I could,
adventures.
yeah,
Well, we can always do
we
this
have to.
again. We can
Yeah,
do this again sometime.
we should, I think. Thank you so much, everyone, and it's great to see you all. And Jeff, you have a piano. That's great to see also, an instrument. Yeah. So take care, everyone, and hope you'll check out Synth Gems, and hope you'll check out aliaszone.com, Chris's musical website also, if you haven't already.
And check out Bjooks to see what else Kim's creating on the book front.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.